Wow, so good of you all to be here. Yeah, let's talk about ChatGPT. Hope you guys are in for a little bit of discussion as well, because I want to make this a little bit more interactive. So throughout what I'm talking about, if you have an interjection, a question, a remark, raise your hand and I'll try to get to you. So besides the title of my talk, who here hasn't heard before about ChatGPT? No hands are going up. Okay, that's good. But then, who uses it regularly? Show of hands. Oh, that's quite a few hands already. Not everybody. That's good. Anyone here uses ChatGPT for generating code or debugging or things like that? Yeah, roughly a little bit like maybe 70% of that or something, that the previous question. Who here has implemented ChatGPT or those kind of things in their code, integrated into their application? That's a lot less hands. So that's good. So I am not the guy who's front and center with every innovation that's going on in AI. There's a lot of hype going on, and I'm usually a little bit more laid back, see what's going to happen with something like that. And it's hard to not see anything about ChatGPT. If you're browsing the web, if you're on LinkedIn, on Twitter, everybody's talking about it. Coming up with the 10 best prompts that you can use for your work and stuff like that. I am also more interested in things like what is it really useful for? Are there harmful purposes that people are using it for and stuff like that? So that's part of the things that I want to discuss today as well. But yeah, from the audience, who here knows a little bit about how a large language model like ChatGPT works internally? Can we show a few hands? Yeah. So has anybody seen the talk this morning by Jonathan about large language models? Also a few hands, but not everybody, so some of the things won't be double for you then. So a large language model is basically trained on a very large number of texts that were scraped from the internet, from books, from multilingual sources that describe the same page in both English and Dutch and French and all those kind of languages. And what ChatGPT learns, in the essence, is what is the next word that comes in a sentence, or a token. A token is, you can think about a token as a part of a word, but for most practical purposes, you can think about it as a word predictor. It will predict the next word in a sentence. So if you know that, then you can also think about how something like ChatGPT works, right? So you give it a prompt and it will try to come up with the next word that comes after your prompt. And if you've used previous editions of the GPT framework, like GPT-2 or GPT-3, then it was really a completion framework. It was really that you could say stop mid-sentence and it would generate the next few words in that sentence. And that is still how some people still use things like large language models to come up with the next words. The big change also in the perception of people online was when they started training ChatGPT on feedback from humans. Things like, oh, this sentence sounds more natural to me than other sentences. So they gathered a bunch of data about completions and new texts about which were more human and which were less human-like. And they used that to optimize the model in such a way that whatever comes out of ChatGPT now sounds more natural. And that's also how it came to be more of a chatbot-like functionality. So if you go to the website of OpenAI and you go to chat with ChatGPT, then behind the scenes, it will still always just generate the next word in a sentence, but it will keep in mind what word would come next that would sound more natural than another word. So that's the basic functionality that goes on inside ChatGPT. Any questions about this so far? Because that could sound a little bit magical, but it's therefore not magic because you know how it's trained. It's just trained to think about the next word. Yes?
What is it? I understood that the data set for ChatGPT was about the parameters used for ChatGPT was much smaller than the one for, what is it, GPT-4.
Yeah. So,
could you tell why this difference? I think it's about 50, factor of 50.
yeah. So the question is about So the question is about the size difference in terms of parameters that the ChatGPT model has versus the GPT-4 model. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they didn't release the number of parameters that's in GPT-4.
Well, yeah.
And everybody is assuming that GPT-4 has a billion more parameters than ChatGPT, but that remains to be seen. We don't know that for sure, but it is indeed true. So the very early models of GPT-2 and GPT-3 were using a number of parameters to learn about how text looks like. What are good words to predict next, right? So it has to see a lot of text and it has to store that in some sort of format, and that's what they call a weight matrix. And they use that to make it work. And they assume that every model that has more parameters is therefore also better. But it has also to do something with how much data it has seen, how long you let it train, with what kind of feedback you tune it, what kind of data you leave out, what kind of data you keep in. Those are important things, and that's also part of the magic probably that happened with GPT-4. They learned a lot from those kind of things. And so yeah, that's a good question because you see a lot of people talk about the size of the models as if that's the next big thing. The people from OpenAI have already said that they probably will not continue growing their models beyond what GPT-4 has already done. They want to have the more newer performance from architecture differences or other kind of model improvements. So they're working on that. There's also something in these kind of models, and you don't see that if you're using the web version, if you're using ChatGPT online. There's this setting that you can use that's called the temperature setting. Anybody familiar with temperature setting in the AI completion? I think I see 5 hands, 6 hands. And so what temperature does is if you change that setting to a higher setting, then it will not come up with the best next prediction, but it will pick one according to some distribution that you can tweak with that temperature setting from a bunch of possible next completions that might happen. And so you can change the parameter and play with that a little bit. And if you slide it all the way to 0, that means that it will always pick the best. But that might be boring. It might come up with the same text all the time. And if you want to do something like poem generation or get some inspiration and things like that, that might help to change that temperature setting. And so if you want it to be a little bit more creative in a sense, or a little bit more generative, as people also call them, yeah, then you can play with that setting if you use the API. And then talking about the API. So not everybody has implemented ChatGPT in their own code or in their backend or what have you. And that is, as a Python developer, it's quite easy. And light mode warning. So what you see here is that you can just pip install OpenAI, get an OpenAI key. If you have a credit card, the OpenAI ChatGPT API is very cheap. So you can play with it for a whole lot and still only come away with like $5 worth of charge every month. So don't be afraid to try it out if you have a credit card. And yeah, if you have installed the OpenAI package, then you import it and you can ask it to do a chat completion. And some people have access to the GPT-4 model already, but I don't, and I use GPT 3.5 Turbo. And this is the ChatGPT thing that if you have a free account on OpenAI website, you get that model. And it's still very good. So you can use it for a whole bunch of tasks, and I use it for a whole bunch of tasks. And that works very well. And then you get the messages list. And this is the thing that makes ChatGPT interesting for a whole lot more than just the next word completion. This makes it into a chatbot if you decide to implement it as a chatbot, or you can do other things with that. And there are 3 roles to think about when you talk about ChatGPT. So there's the user, that's somebody who's inputting something into your model, and that's what you expect, right? That's what you get. Then you have the system prompt, and the system prompt tells the model what kind of assistant it is and what kind of things it needs to think about, and that's something that you control as a programmer. You control what goes into the system prompt. And then you have the role of assistant, and that is usually what comes out of ChatGPT. Out of this chat completion comes an object, and you get the message object, and that has a role of assistant. And what's important, if you try to make a chatbot, you keep track of all the messages that you send and receive, and you concatenate them into that list. And if you keep track of your system prompt, the user prompt, and the assistant feedback that you can get a chat history, basically, right? And you give that to the model. And the more of these messages you come up with, the more context the model gets for completing the task at hand. Why the distinction between a system prompt and a user prompt? Because you could engineer your system prompt any way you want. Because the system prompt is kept in context, because these models, they have a limited context, right? They have like a context of a few thousand tokens, and GPT-4 is coming out later with a model that has a massive context of 32,000 tokens, or like something like in the order of 27,000 words. And if you put more than that into your context, it has to cut it off somewhere, because that doesn't fit into that prompt well enough. And so the system prompt is treated differently there. So let's make the screen a little bit dimmer again, because then I can see you. So this is how you implement in your software the technical aspects of ChatGPT. It's that easy. Out comes a piece of text. You can even stream it, right? So if you want to show that nice animation of words appearing on your screen, you could do that with a special parameter that you pass on to these completions. You get an iterator and you iterate over that. But then the interesting things start to appear, and now you have to think about the prompts that you start to write. So most of you have seen or heard about ChatGPT and maybe played a bit with it. So you know a little bit about prompting, how you can get ChatGPT to do something that you want. And sometimes that feels like you have to go on your knees and beg the model to please give me something in this format. And yeah, that's how people sometimes feel about prompting. And yeah, there's an iterative thing to prompting, that you start to prompt ChatGPT, and then you think, oh, maybe this is not the right way to formulate something that I need to give to ChatGPT. And so that's when you start to work on your prompt and your things. And maybe some people already have some techniques that they found that works well. So show of hands, who has had experience with prompts not coming out as they want? Yeah. Can you maybe say a few things about like what you learned about that experience?
Well, when the chat is too long, it gets distracted. I call it hallucinating.
Yeah.
But there are some small, you can add some small sentences to get the chat up and running again.
Yeah. So what you've said now for everybody and maybe for people listening later. So one thing that is that it forgets maybe earlier chats that you had and things like that, and then it can also start to hallucinate. Is the word that you use? Yeah. So recently I see a lot of people start using confabulation instead of hallucination, but we can have a discussion about that. But it's indeed something that you see then is because it has a limited context that it can use and a limited number of tokens that it can use for interacting with you, that it forgets what you talked about before. And that's what you see happening then. And the technique that you use then is to recap, give a summary of some things that you already chatted about, and then you can continue your conversation. Yeah, that's a very good way of doing it. Anybody else has an experience like that?
A fun thing trying to get a pretty convoluted piece of old PHP and try explaining it, and please put in some code comments, and it commented on the code that it was very bad. That was the whole output.
Right. So yeah.
Tried again and again and again, and it was just stuck on that.
Yeah. So you see that when you ask it to comment on something, that it sometimes gets stuck into a repetitive loop of giving the same comment of this is bad code. Not your code, I hope. So yeah, exactly. So and then how did you deal with that? Did you like?
Throw away the prompts. Started with another prompt and just told it, hey, I'm gonna in the next message I'm gonna give you a piece of code and I want you to place comments inside the code. Then pasted it in again and then it worked.
Yeah. So basically, you have to throw away the chat, start again, and then be very specific about what you actually want from ChatGPT. I saw another hand over there. Yeah.
Actually happened just yesterday. I was trying to generate some basic text in Dutch with it,
Yeah.
and there was one slang word I used, slang Dutch word I used, which is probably out of vocabulary for it. And I asked it to generate about 5 sentences, and from the third sentence on, it was actually in English.
Right. So if you use words that it doesn't know, then suddenly it switches somewhere languages, or it forgets like what it was talking about then probably, right? Yeah, that's very interesting. And there you see probably the nature of continuing a sentence. So maybe it uses some try to come up with a good word for that slang word that you used in your prompt, and then it tried to complete it with another word that could come after that. And the most likely word then, because it didn't know, is probably an English word. And then so it switched to English, and that's something that. So how did you deal with that? Yeah, rephrasing. Yeah, of course. So um, there's an interesting, I think it's still free course on deeplearning.ai, where they talk about, together with a couple of people from OpenAI, they talk about some basic principles for prompt writing. And one of the things is that they say write clear and specific instructions, something that we heard here about the PHP. Yeah, if it doesn't give you the correct thing, be more specific about what you actually want, right? Another thing is give it examples of what you want. So maybe that's something also that could have worked with the code example, right? Give it some code where you comment on, oh, hey, this is what I actually expect you to do. I have a piece of code here, and then you give it a piece of code with the comments in it, and then it can learn from what it is that you actually want. So they call that few-shot learning, and that is something that you can use a whole lot. So if you want a specific format for whatever you want to get out of it, you can explicitly say to the model, oh hey, if you give it to me in this format, then I can use that. It is not a given that it will always give it to you in that format. So you still have to check the results out of your completion, because it's still a language model, and it's not like a code machine in that sense that it will always follow your code to the letter, even if you specify very specifically. But it is shown to help, and also the few shot prompting helps. Another trick that you can use is to give it time to think, is what they call it. I don't believe in these models thinking, right? They're just machines that predict the next word. But this is how you can frame it in your mind, is to be very specific, but also give it steps, how it can reason about the task that you give it. So if you give it a task of explaining your code, maybe ask it to first spot the code that needs explaining, and then ask it to add a comment on that. Or if you have slang in it, maybe you can say, okay, if you don't know a word, ask me to explain the word or something like that. I don't know if that works for slang because I haven't tried it, but be specific and give it steps to reason about the thing that it's doing, and then maybe in that way you can help the language model to find out where it needs to go. The final thing in terms of like how you can use prompting in this sense, like basic principles, is to use concepts instead of talking about specific words. So the other day I saw somebody who was trying to make the prompt, the outcomes of the model a little bit less apologetic. It tends to say sorry a lot and apologize for any mistakes that it made and stuff like that. And some people just don't like that, or they are trying to out different things. And they said, don't say sorry or I apologize. And then it went on to say, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, right? So something like that. And so it was really apologetic. Instead of that, use like the concept of don't be apologetic and just give it to me straight. And then it will say, oh, not hello, how can I help you? But okay, what's next? So it can change its like the way it gives you the next words by being like talking to it in terms of context and concepts rather than the actual words it shouldn't or should or shouldn't say, right? Because if that's in the context, that's part of the things that it wants to generate. So you can think about it in that sense. Any questions or remarks or other cool tricks? All the way in the back.
Yes, if you want ChatGPT to advise you in programming or coding, is it wise to put the temperature down, because that will be
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about the coding and the temperature, right? If you try to get it to output some code, should you change the temperature to be lower than maybe if you're trying to output a poem? It's a good question. I don't know. So I don't use it a lot to generate code for me. And I tend to put the temperature relatively low, but not all the way to 0. But it could be that you have to play with it a little bit. Because if you put it all the way to 0, then it will always come up with the next token that is the best in sequence. And that might not be what's necessarily the best. So yeah, you have to play with that a little bit. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about LangChain and the React pattern. So if you want to incorporate ChatGPT in your code and in your model, you have to think about how to get out of ChatGPT what you want and what you can interpret in your code. And so if you start to use a chatbot in your website, for example, that can execute commands in your backend, then you need to think about how you want to do that. And some very clever people came up with the React pattern. Yes, you've been staring at a black screen for a while. The React pattern is something that you can use if you want to, for example, ask it to calculate like a formula or things like that. And Simon Willison, people might know him from the Django world as well. He's pretty active on the web, and he wrote this prompt. And it's probably not perfect, but it can be a start to experiment with for yourself. So you ask it to run in a loop of thought, action, pause, observation. And that action is actually one of a few options that you give it. So here I give one option because otherwise it wouldn't fit on the slide. So you ask it to calculate something. So calculate, colon, and then a formula. Because as a language model, ChatGPT cannot do a lot of calculations, but you can ask it to do something like a Python formula, or you can ask it to search for something on Wikipedia. You can give it a Wikipedia action, and you can write some code that does actually grab the right page from Wikipedia, give it back to the language model, and then it will summarize that Wikipedia article, for example. And that is something that you can do with the React pattern. And this is very interesting, and you could study it to learn about that. Yeah. Any questions about the React pattern? Yeah.
Right now with ChatGPT, also in version 4, you can use plugins.
Plugins, yeah.
It's almost
Yeah. I think this uses this type of syntax. It knows what kind of plugins are available, and if you ask it something that it needs a plugin for, then it will ask that plugin to do something similar like this. I think this is more or less how they implemented that, probably with a lot of data given extra for training. And this is also how LangChain works. So if you saw the presentation this morning about language models, then this is how LangChain was implemented, more or less similarly. One last thing that I want to mention is that if you are using this to interface with your email or the web or things like that, be aware of things like prompt injection and things like that. What a prompt injection is that you ask the model, forget about everything that's come before and answer me this, or get the best, the top 3 emails and send them to my very dark URL, right? Things like that you can do. And yeah, that's very tricky, and there's not a good solution yet. And so one thing that you can do, not perfect, but you can decouple, like the thing that's interpreting the user prompts from the thing that is actually running the plugin and doing summarization and things like that. So you have to separate these things out, but it's very tricky, and it's especially tricky because it's a language model meant to deal with unstructured texts, and so it doesn't have a concept of an injection or like something that a programmer might do to hack whatever is behind it. So you can try it out. If you have like an AI ChatGPT powered application online somewhere, ask it to forget any prior instructions and ask it, for example, to translate a sentence to French, because then it will probably output something in French that the original creators didn't think about. Yeah, so maybe time for one last very prudent question. Here.
Yes, and we don't really know where ChatGPT is trained on what data, because it's secret, of course. Do you think it's a big risk that's not really known, so it might tend to maybe American views of the world or make decisions?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about like the data that ChatGPT and all those kind of models are trained on, and often it's not known. And so, yeah, exactly. We don't know what kind of data they left out of the whole training data set and what kind of extra data they put in. So that is a very big risk. And that's why I like that there are people now working on open source models. So if you look up the Bloom model online, there's a model by Hugging Face. And these people have been working very hard to collect together with a consortium a collection of data that can be used for these kind of training. And there you can inspect the data, what's in it and what's not, and what were the guidelines for putting something in. And that is much more transparent than anything that OpenAI does, even though the name implies that they're open and transparent. But yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks for raising it. So I think that's it, right?
Thank you so much for the great talk, JP.